5,000 runners took to the streets of London this morning, hoping to cover the 26 gruelling miles of the London Marathon. We can see how they fared in 40 minutes here on One. And that's after more viewers have had the chance to bite back.
Con 301, Labour 298. I've got no idea what's happened. I'll try and find out. What's happened, Vicky?
Con 301.
Are we confident about it, Vicky? Are we confident about it?
I'm more nervous than I've ever been before any previous programme, but I'm also reasonably confident, fingers tightly crossed, that everything will work out all right.
Hello, Bristol Hub. This is the London director calling. Are you hearing talkback?
Absolutely the worst thing is total power failure. We go down to battery power and a bit of a generator and a sort of steam-powered camera pointing at David, and he says, well, we have a problem here, over to Glasgow. And that's what we're hoping doesn't happen. We'll be all right.
Wonderful work at Paddy Ashdown's house. Fantastic. Look at that.
Brilliant.
Anyway, this way, turning these red Labour MPs blue will mean a Conservative landslide.
Peter, can I just stop you for a second? I'm sorry to catch you in rehearsal like this, but you're surrounded by all kinds of bits and pieces here. Give us an idea of what it's all about.
Bits and pieces? This is our new swingometer.
What have I said?
This is when the place comes alive. Everybody's together. Radio, television, the regions, London. It's great.
10,
correct.
9,
I guess we'll be there.
Here on BBC One, the stage is now
Can you get a print out of that, Francis, as soon as possible?
David Dimbleby.
Print out Dimbleby as soon as possible. Write it down for Dimbleby ASAP, please.
On air. We are on air.
We've got 50
Good
seconds
luck,
on
one
the
all.
time.
Write those figures off the screen and make sure it's on David's desk so it's there when he gets there.
Missing something, that's the real worry, that you might miss an important result, or someone might make a speech that you miss and someone else shows it, and we look as if we've been slow and we haven't made the right decisions, or maybe something breaks down and you don't get to an important story.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC's election night coverage. We'll be up in Birmingham, where tonight they're counting 12 constituencies in one hall.
Well, around the country, at various sites, we have a total of about 150 cameras, and they're feeding into about 85 OBs, and they're feeding into sort of 8, 9 hubs around the country, and they all feed down to us.
All the outside broadcasts, or OBs, send their pictures into this room just off the London studio. Throughout the evening, London's constantly demanding interviews with the winners and losers, shots of the declarations, anything that will tell the developing election story. One of the first requests to Birmingham is for an interview with Deputy Labour leader Roy Hattersley. But with 85 OBs all competing for airtime and the unpredictability of covering a live event, there are no guarantees.
Jessica.
Hattersley's getting really angry. We'd better come to him very...
I'll pass her on. NIA to Hub.
Go ahead.
I'm told that Mr. Hattersley is getting somewhat impatient. Actually, the word that was used was angry.
No, I'm still very keen on him, but once you tell him he's there, then I know I can try and get to him.
If we don't go soon, he'll go somewhere else. Do you want us to record him? No.
You can hang on to him. I'm warning them in London.
Yeah.
They're coming to him very soon.
They're doing their best, but he is getting very impatient. He's going. He's gone. I hope this doesn't go on like this all night.
John, we lost the first feed, Roy Hattersley going into London. What went wrong there?
It's a case of priorities. It's London's priorities. We offer. They have a lot of other outside broadcasts coming in, and their priorities, they have to decide themselves. We offer, but they make the decisions in London.
Results are phoned in from all over the country to the London studio.
We're getting a bit busy now, and we're expecting more perhaps North East next. Can you log in for that one? BBC results. 355, name of the constituency. Winning party.
And the winning party? Labour. So that's a Labour gain from
Thank you very much. the Conservative.
Well, what we're doing is taking in all the results from results providers at every constituency. So 651 people are due to call in sometime between about 10 minutes ago and tomorrow afternoon. And we will be entering them into our computer. And that'll generate all the pictures you see, all the headlines, all the information for Brown Redhead, Peter Snow, everybody in radio and television, everybody in the regions. So this is where it all happens. If we get it wrong, everybody knows about it. If we get it right, I don't suppose anyone will ever notice.
The results unit also monitors the opposition, ITN, to see which results they're pushing out. At this early stage, they're already 2 ahead of the BBC.
You don't want to see these trucks then, John?
No.
No?
No, because we're going live now to London.
OK.
Meanwhile, Birmingham are still trying to get Hattersley on the show.
It looks like they're going to Scotland for a bit first.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Jessica.
Yes, Jessica.
We're getting from Hattersley is that if we don't come to him at 11:30, well, in Patrick's words, he won't renew the BBC's charter if he becomes home secretary.
I can believe that. They probably won't anyway.
Here is the measure of Labour's failure. What Mr. Kinnock had to do was to turn all these 100 or so blue Conservative MPs red. These are the key seats in the battleground, and on our swingometer, they're the ones that had to go down to a Labour swing. Watch how they change colour, how they should be changing colour.
As a piece of equipment, just technologically speaking, it looks incredibly high-tech, but actually there's still a man up there.
Oh, it is frightfully high-tech. Oh, yeah, Harry's up there. Harry, you there? Harry? The trouble is, occasionally, whenever I really want him, he goes off for a cup of tea. Harry, are you there? He is. Look, he's there. He's there. He's there. He'll be there all night.
And how accurate is this?
Well, that is what I was about to tell you about, because when you said, when you asked about technology, it's quite extraordinary. Up at the top of it, there is what's called a potentiometer, which I gather is actually quite a usual thing to have in electronics. And that potentiometer is being told, whenever I move this even an inch, that potentiometer, through its binding of conductive plastic, sorry, binding I think is the wrong word, but it's coil of conductive plastic, tells the computer that I've moved this pendulum over Linda Chalker, there she is, in Wallasey, right? Now, Linda Chalker in Wallasey, because I've moved the pendulum over her, will turn red because it's a Labour swing.
Mayday, mayday, this is Peter Snow. Yes, 200 miles away, almost at the other end of the studio. Remember, it's all a bit of fun, just a new government, 5 years of government, just a bit of fun, that's all it is. Who'll win? Well, it's still too early to say, but it's not too early to say dibble, 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 squeak. So, unlike Jason Donovan, it still could go both ways. We're on tenterhooks, the producer's on Valium, I'm on the front cover of Radio Times, and you're not. David.
To be honest, I have the easiest job on the show, because all I have to do is sit down there. Have you seen? It's rather fun. Can I show you? I sit down over here. Sit down over here on this keyboard, and all I have to do, you see, is to dial in a button. I mean, for example, if we want to see, for example, a map of the country, right? All I do is I dial in 1, and then I go execute, right? Right. And up comes a map of the country, and it'll come up in a second. If it doesn't come up, then I'm in real trouble, true, and then I have to sort of talk my way out of it and hand back to David Dimbleby. There it is, you see? No results in yet, it'll say 0, 0, 0. But if I hadn't got that would look after me, and David Dimbleby doesn't have the same kind of graphics that I do, but if I hadn't got all these graphics to look after me, I'd be sunk. Then yes. I would have to be as good as David Dimbleby, so talking my way out of a difficult corner. But as it is, all I have to do is press these buttons, up comes the graphic, and then the graphic, as it were, tells me what to say.
I tried desperately to track the story, and I here can talk straight to Peter Horrocks into his ear, scream at him and say, listen, we must do the London story now, Snow's standing by. And when Snow's standing by, he's certainly standing by, he's jumping up and down, screaming at me, saying, get us on the air, get us on the air.
Louise to John.
Yeah, Louise. Yes, Louise.
Is Hattersley literally standing by ready to go now?
Yes, do you want to see the shot?
Peter Snow is not the only one who's impatient to get on air.
Question is, John, the question is he prepared to do a 1+2 with Malcolm Rifkind?
Is he prepared to do a 1+2 with Malcolm Rifkind? Jessica? 1+...
Yes or no?
Negative, Louise, negative. Mr. Hattersley won't do a 1+2. I wish I'd been smoking more.
Must find Labour people, must find Labour interviewees.
Sometime later, as the size of the Labour defeat becomes apparent, London's desperate for a reaction from the ground.
Thank you, James. Chase Labour, chase Labour, chase Labour.
Birmingham's doing its best to comply.
Mr. Hattersley, could you possibly join us at the BBC now? We are
here.
Up there, we're ready.
Down here I will, but I'm not coming up there. Everybody else will come down here.
Can we call
Right.
you Reg?
Patrick, Jessica,
What's happened, Patrick?
Mr. Hattersley will give interviews on the floor only. He will not come up to our position. He says other people have got crews down here, so it's up to us to organise
Have you
it.
lost him to ITN?
Well, he's just given an interview to ITN, so, I mean, we're just trying to organise it so that we can conduct the interview down here. Patrick to Jessica, can David do the interview down here? Do we have the technology to organise it quickly?
Reporter, camera, Hattersley and London finally all converge at 2:40 a.m.
So now we join Roy Hattersley, who's with David Davis, in Birmingham.
You sound as though it's almost over.
I don't mean to. My answer was intended to be nothing other than evasive.
Mr. Hattersley, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Are you pleased with it?
Yeah, I mean, I was delighted that we got there in the end. I mean, it's been a struggle, and obviously in many ways, well, a difficult night for many of the politicians here.
React here in Coventry South East.
Looking for lots of reaction shots after the Bath result, which will be a patent defeat.
Like to add the name of the chairman of the Conservative Party. Well, it's written on their faces. Lavender Patton on the left there, Chris Patton's wife, on the left of screen, and Chris Patton exhausted after this campaign and never able to spend more than...
Back in the results area, the gap between ITN and the BBC is widening.
They are running by different rules than we are running. We give a result when it's been declared or when we have figures on a black from a returning officer. They are going on some figures that are hours before the actual declaration. The City of London, for example, they called 2.5 hours ago. We haven't had a declaration yet.
So they're not concrete results, then? It's a speculation.
They're what their journalists say is going to happen. Well, I mean, I can call 400 results now. I don't mind.
Yeah.
But that's not how the BBC works, so that's not how we're doing it.
Let's have a look now at the swingometer with 605 results in and see what it shows, Peter. Peter, has it lived up to its reputation?
Well, I think you must judge that.
No, you tell us.
Well, of course I think it has, yes. But I tell you what, let me show you what it'll tell us first, and then you tell me whether you think it's lived up to its reputation. I mean, it hasn't got much reputation yet. We've only had about 3 hours to prove it. But anyway, let's have a go. Now, let me just show you again. There.
You seem to be getting a lot of Peter on. You seem to be quite successful.
Well, I'm glad you think so. We're always complaining. We think we ought to get to Scotland. We've got Scotland standing by in the box there, ready to go. We haven't done enough on Scotland yet, and we haven't done enough on what's happening in the marginals. But it's going pretty well. It's great fun.
Just one question. How's it been going so far?
Well, I mean, extraordinary. It's full of surprises. Very exciting. Full of surprises.
You've been pursuing quite a strange story.
Unexpected and mixed results. But in the end, one has to say, very broadly, a national success for the Conservatives, surprising the polls, surprising our exit polls, surprising everything people expected in the middle of this recession.
What he's concerned with is, first of all, closers would stand for. What do you think will mark a major administration?
I haven't got any Labour interviews at the moment. I go to some more Tory interviews, then I'll come to it.
That was what he said.
120 votes, yes.
Just when this extraordinary marathon of an evening should have come to an end, editor Peter Horrocks decides to keep his team working right through to breakfast time. Because of the unexpected result, he wants to wait for John Major's return to Downing Street.
Yes, we're going to keep going for a long time if we're going to wait for Major to get back. We'll go to Alenka Frenkel next. It's Tory jubilation time at the moment. There's plenty of space.
Steady nerves needed by all on the night. Now it's time for our studio audience to put forward their views on the BBC's election coverage. In the BiteBack hot seat are Mark Damazer, editor of the 9 o'clock news, and the BBC's chief political correspondent, John Sargent, who's been reporting throughout the campaign. Now, one thing we do know for sure is that the opinion polls got it wrong. Stephen Cobb, you've got a question about this, haven't you?
Yes, I'm wondering if you now regret the considerable, and a lot of people would say excessive coverage, you gave 2 opinion polls during the campaign. They gave me the impression that they were dominating a lot of the news, and they obviously were wrong in the outcome.
Mark, how do you like to kick off on that one?
I hope in talking about opinion polls I don't sound like an alcoholic put in charge of a temperance society, but let me have a go. There are 3 or 4 points I'd like to make. The first is that the BBC had a policy in the first instance not to spend any money at all commissioning its own national voting intention poll, because we felt that there were so many other people doing that it would have been a waste of your money, the licence payers' money, if we'd done that, and we stuck to that throughout.
The second was that we had some guidelines set out beforehand about the way polls should be reported, indeed including the amount of prominence we should give to it at the top of the bulletin, and we stuck to those. I have to say there was one night in the middle of the campaign where you'll remember there were 3 polls that came out at the same time that seemed to give Labour a rather wider lead than previous polls had. And I was tempted, frankly, to lead with it that night, but I didn't, and I'm sure in retrospect that appears to be right, because the polls the following day showed a different pattern. So we were very careful not to give the polls headline prominence or lead story prominence, in, I think, contradistinction to some other organisations that gave them rather more mileage than we did. The third is, and you've just seen Peter Snow there, that through the instrument of Peter Snow, who is, of course, wonderfully enthusiastic, but also a marvellously sober and sane journalist, the polls reporting that we did do, I hope, was in extremely good context. We never gave polls without talking about the trend of the polls, to explain that polls couldn't be taken in isolation on one night. They had to be seen in terms of the context that had come up before those polls came out.
Mr. Cobb, would you just like to comment?
I was going to say, why spend any time on opinion polls, which are simply a measure of what some people somewhere think, when obviously they can't predict the outcome, and I don't think people would want them to predict the outcome.
That's a fair point. I think they're not supposed to predict the outcome. As the pollsters themselves would say, they're only providing a snapshot of a particular public mood at a particular time. They themselves must be now having a rather grand inquest as to whether they got that right. And
John
clearly,
Sargent, can we
the
go
evidence
to
is
you?
not.
Do they not obscure the issues sometimes, do you think?
No, I think the difficulty that we've got is that we're trying to follow all the excitements and the dramas of the campaign as well as the issues, and the politicians are very much affected by the opinion polls, and everybody else is. People are desperate to know what the outcome is. Looking
because
back...
the politicians are desperate.
Well, everybody's desperate to know. Everyone sees it as a race.
Wait a minute. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Well, they want to know.
I regard the BBC electoral coverage during the whole of the campaign as a betrayal of democracy. Democracy is the election of members of Parliament to represent me. What the BBC portrayed was the election of a leader, a party and a government, and this is an entirely different and separate matter.
Can I just answer that point directly? I mean, I think that obviously some people before the election were convinced that we would somehow, in some sense, decide it, or that, as you say, we would betray democracy. But surely the conclusion any reasonable person would draw from all this is that we didn't, in fact, betray democracy. Democracy exerted itself on polling night, and everyone could see that despite the balance that we'd given to the two parties, it was clear the Conservatives who won a tremendous victory, and we explained that. I mean, I think you know, people can't have it both ways.
Yes? Well, I think you've given a stereotype reply throughout on this. Why not say to yourself that the polls were not wrong? And if they're not wrong, why not find the reason why at least 4% of the Conservative supporters were not in the polls? And I'd ask you to look at things like the expatriate, the holiday makers, as well as the foreign voters who don't come into the polls. I think you ought to do your analysis on it. Let's assume that the polls were right and that the Tories, about 10 days beforehand, when we opened the postal votes, they saw that their card had come home.
Right, can I just suggest, if say we'd followed that, if we'd said now, we'll forget all the arguments going on at the moment, we must look at the expatriate vote, we must look at this, we must look at that, people would have thought we were then behaving eccentrically. I think one of the things that you've got to appreciate in election coverage, and it is a difficult point, it's not an exact science, no one pretends it is an exact science, but you are trying to follow an extremely complicated battle. Nobody knows what, for instance, in the Second World War was the significance of El Alamein. Well, you wouldn't have thought a place in the North African desert would decide that part of the war. Now, it may seem in retrospect perfectly obvious that there was a set-piece battle there between the forces, but these are the complexities in an election campaign that afterwards it's all quite simple to say, oh, that was terribly relevant or it wasn't terribly relevant, but you've got to see what we have to do on a day-by-day basis.
I think you made that point. Yes, sir. You made the original point. Yes.
My question has not been understood. I did not say the election of a particular leader. I said the election of a leader as opposed to the election of a representative. Now, you concentrated on interviewing all the leaders, whether rightly, wrongly, whether in balance or not. We should have left the leaders alone and looked at the people.
Yes, Mark, you briefly, please, Mark, on that, because I must push this along.
An election is obviously an extremely complicated phenomenon, and one of the things that you're deciding is who you want to be Prime Minister. But of course, as you rightly say, there are 651 individual contests there. If we had devoted an awful lot of time to an awful lot of those contests, we would have had to have each candidate on who was in that constituency as a result of the restraints quite rightly imposed on us by the Representation of the People's Act. In the end, that's not a practical way, I think, of filling a 45-minute bulletin. I hope, though, that we didn't concentrate on the leaders to the exclusion of talking about the issues, about the economy, about the health.
Just a second. Now, I would like to bring in some of our young first-time voters here. Now, as far as you're concerned, do you think that the BBC helped you to understand the issues?
I think that, well, to a large extent, the rest of the news itself was ignored, first of all. It just seemed, especially on the 9 o'clock in its 50-minute format, that sort of there was the election news first, then sort of give the woman the rest of the news for about 5 minutes. You know, the rest of the world blew up today, and then back to the election for another half hour. But yeah, I think within the election coverage we got, not the right emphasis was given to the issues that we as first-time voters think are important. Everything seemed to be very much on, there's a lot of hung parliaments and then the whole rather sterile thing about the Jennifer's ear war. Things like education, student hardship, Europe, racism, and particularly the environment seem to get, at best, just a token mention, really.
Right. Okay, we'll deal with those in a minute. What, have you got the point you'd like to make?
Yeah, I've been discussing with pupils at my school as well who are also first-time voters, and we just can't see the point of two grown-up people standing up and trying to put each other down. We don't care about, you know, if they want to put each other down. All we care about is what issues are what and what's going to be best for us.
What you're saying is they're trying to score political points and not discussing issues. Yeah, what do you think?
And I think that the lack of actual coverage of issues, it was very bad. I mean, campaigns should be fought on issues and not personalities. The BBC covered what John Major did today, what Paddy Ashdown did today, and not what the parties thought.
Right, well, let's deal with a number of points there, Mark. I mean, let's deal first of all, perhaps, but rather briefly, with the balance between the news, between election news and other news.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of fair points. We structured the programme in such a way that the election coverage was divided by the rest of the news, precisely so that if important things were happening, and indeed what was going on in Russia and the battle over the Black Sea Fleet, what was going on in South Africa and so on, were given decent prominence both in the headlines and by not having to wait till the end of the programme. The really fundamental question you ask is about the most difficult one, both for programme producers and I think for democracy as a whole, which is what is the agenda and who sets it? And nothing could be more important than that question during a general election campaign. And there is no right answer, to be truthful. If we'd had 55 minutes or an hour, it may be that some of these issues, which were not given as much prominence as you would have liked, would have had more prominence. All I can say is this, that with about 10 or 12 days to go, I drew up a list of a variety of issues which I felt, for one reason or another, had either been ignored or marginalised. And I did try very hard to make certain that those issues were actually discussed on the 9 o'clock news and put forward, even if only towards the end of the campaign. Issues like Europe, issues like proportional representation, issues like race, indeed, where we ran a film, as I remember it, with just 2 days to go. So although it's not perfect, because it never can be, I do hope that we gave a really broad spread of the kind of issues that were a concern to most of the electorate most of the time.
Mr. O'Brien? Mr. O'Brien, yes.
Mark, I'd like to mention in particular the priority given to items on the news about 3 weeks ago on a Sunday. If you recall, late the night before, there was a helicopter accident, disaster in the North Sea, and approximately 11 people died. Now, by the next day, they were still searching for 6 bodies. That was the second item on the news, 25 minutes later. Now, to me, an election is about the fundamental nature of what society is going to be. Are we actually saying that public rhetoric, political rhetoric, is much more important than human life, particularly on a day of rest, Sunday?
Decent question. The Saturday, which was a programme that I remember vividly because the story broke shortly before we were going to go on air, we actually thought we had, in inverted commas, a good news story because we thought there had been a miraculous rescue. And during the course of the programme, we even got a report that suggested that that was happening and that it was all over and that only one person had died. As you point out, on the Sunday, the story was very different. In the main evening bulletin, the one that I'm responsible for, we did actually lead on the helicopter story. We didn't.
Not 9 o'clock.
We did. No, we didn't. We did on the main evening bulletin. On the earlier ones, as you correctly point out, we didn't.
Sorry, I thought we were here to discuss the election coverage, basically, which was frankly abysmal and pathetic. Not just at the BBC, but right across the board. It wasn't about informing the public, it was about misinforming the public. All we heard were Tweedledum, Tweedledee and Tweedlethree for a solid month. And there is a lot of good thinking on the fringe, on the so-called fringe of the political arena, which was never allowed a voice at all. I mean, who spoke for the...
Let's hear from one of them then. There's the Green Party up there. Let's hear from the fringe.
Well, the fringe is only the fringe because we've been excluded from the main debate.
what does a party have to do to become one of the main parties? We may get the occasional item, but it's very much squeezed in instead of a skateboarding duck.
What does the Green Party have to do to get your attention?
I think the difficulty is, I can quite imagine how you feel. I think that all minority parties and people that I meet who feel passionately about politics long for their own issues and the things that they care about to be presented by us. And when I meet them, I'm very conscious of the fact that we are failing them directly. This doesn't mean to say we're failing the body politic or that we're failing the country at large, but for them, our coverage will also always seem inadequate. And all I can say is that you've got to, if you're going to start a political party, be aware of the difficulties of our system, of any political system nationally, and how long it takes to form the Labour Party, how long it takes to get MPs, how much effort has to go into that. And perhaps the smaller parties be more aware of the fact...
You could still give them an hour to hold...
All right, can I just make one last point then? People said how much coverage we gave to the War of Jennifer's Ear. I was responsible for a report on the 6 o'clock news, which covered all aspects of that, including what different editors of newspapers thought, what the grandfather thought, and so on. I was given 6 minutes and 17 seconds. Now, that is the kind of time constraint that people like me have to work under.
We have time constraints too, John, so very severe time constraints. Did you have a point you wanted to make, sir?
I think the BBC did a good job. Quite honestly, these people, okay, they've got a right to criticise. We've all got a right to criticise, but let's look at it another way. 55 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. The BBC, along with Radio 4, gave the opportunity to anybody to ring in and talk to these various parties live on TV or radio.
But
now,
anybody couldn't talk, it's censored.
Right, thank you. At least we can end on that positive note. That's the very last you'll hear from us, at least, about the election. Thanks to our studio audience and to our hot seat guests. Remember, BiteBack's here, and if you've got any complaints, let's know about them. Our address follows shortly, and it's in the Radio Times. See you next month.
You can write to us at BiteBack, PO Box 2085, London W12 8XR, and please include your phone number. Or call us on the BiteBack hotline, 081 749 9779.
There's a real danger now that the BBC as we know it will not survive.
Open Space, programmes made by you.
I think the BBC may be past its peak.
The future of public service broadcasting.
All the old listeners like me have been thrown off the end of the sledge, and we don't like it.
Viewers and listeners campaign. Open Space tomorrow at 7:40 on BBC Two.
Bandits, 10 o'clock!
It's your 24th mission. Your gunners trapped in the belly of a B-17.
Cap, we got a problem.
Your landing gears shattered.
I'm not gonna die in here. I got too much to live for.
You need a miracle. Kevin Costner stars in Steven Spielberg's Amazing Stories. Easter Day, 5:30 on BBC One.